All right, welcome to Halitics. I'm Hal Ginsberg. So glad to be talking today. It is a Friday, the free for all, of course. And I hope you'll call me. I was so psyched with all the comments in the chat yesterday on YouTube to see so many people engaging. It was really nice to see. Call me. That's what we do here. That's a little different than just about not every. There are a few programs, there are a few progressive shows where they take calls on occasion, but we do that, whenever. If you hear something that I say that you disagree with, as long as I'm live, I'll take your calls. I mean, unless there's some sort of a tech issue, or I got other people waiting to talk to me. Yeah, I'll take your call. I want to hear from you. That's what we're trying to do here, is come up with solutions, a consensus on how best to address the very serious problems that we are facing. And I don't know any better way to do that than through conversation, through dialogue, through discussion. So yes, call 240-242-5646. And then, or before you call, subscribe if you haven't yet done so. Click that blue and white square, bottom right of your screen if you haven't yet, and become a Halitics YouTube subscriber. You can also, of course, join us on Facebook. We've got lots of great comments there on Facebook in the Halitics page. I don't always promote it, but really do go there a lot to see what the folks are thinking. And I certainly share my insights as well, to the extent I have any insights. 240-242-5646. Did I share? I'm not sure yet. Let me share my feed here to Halitics, by the way. I think I did everything but share it. I have a lot of like my checklist of what I have to do, test this, post that, check the other thing. And sure that I'm sharing on Facebook Halitics, this feed. All right, so free for all. A lot of times I do address issues that come up during the week, kind of revisit stories, not necessarily bring up brand new topics, although sometimes I do. There aren't really that many brand new topics on Halitics. We kind of center the same stuff. You probably figure that out if you're a regular. But I wanted to get back to the Texas Democratic primary and maybe touch on as well the Republican primary there, which is the three-way race involving Ken Paxton and the current Senator John Cornyn, as well as a congressman named Wes. I forget Wes's last name. He is kind of the likely third place finisher. So we'll talk about that a little bit, but I was intrigued that Nate Silver, the Oracle, as I've referred to him on occasion, decided to weigh in on the disparity, the apparent disparity in any event, between the polling numbers that seem, at least at first blush, to strongly favor Jasmine Crockett, the Texas congresswoman whose district was gerrymandered out by the legislature, right? They decided to get rid of as many Democratic Congress members as they could, and they redrew the map. So she no longer has a district. She's running in the primary for senator against James Tallarico. And the polling that I looked at and I discussed yesterday certainly struck me as indicating she's going to win. Two reputable universities, certainly, that were sponsoring polls, the University of Houston and the University of Texas, have Crockett ahead, and ahead with a bullet. The Texas poll, more just dropped, had her up by 12. There was no poll, at least recently, at least going back into early January, that showed Tallarico with anything like a sizable lead. So to me, reputable polls, consensus, Crockett ahead, growing lead, Crockett wins. But the betting markets say differently. And I remarked on that yesterday, tried to come up with some explanations. So does Nate Silver. He posted a little bit after I did, along with Eli McCown Dawson. You can see it was about a little bit after yesterday's program this came up. And here's what Dawson tweeted with Silver's repost. The polls are all over the place in the Texas Dem primary. So why is Tallarico so far ahead in the prediction markets? Silver and I have some answers, and then he puts there a bold. No one wants to poll the Texas Democratic primary. Well, first of all, I read that and thought, well, the polls aren't really all over the place. The polls suggest that Crockett has consolidated a lead. They're not really all over the place. And they posted at, part of that tweet or X post, whatever you want to call it, the polls. So I want to just look at these for a sec, because what was posted, and this chart here in the Silver Bulletin, right? Because it's Nate Silver, so he calls it the Silver Bulletin, as opposed, Silver Bulletin, in case you didn't get that. I don't think they're all over the place. Now, they're all over the place if you look at the top two, which is a public policy polling and impact research, which do have Tallarico ahead by 6 and 4 points respectively. And then you've got the UT poll and the Houston poll more recently. I throw out those Tallarico polls. I throw those last two out, the top two, right? Most recent two. I throw those out. I give them zero. Honestly, I give them virtually nil weight. They're sponsored by the candidate. They are not trustworthy. Those polls are biased to an extent that we really have no idea. We can't possibly know how much of a thumb the Tallarico campaign has put on the scale in support of finding that he's leading, and by a certain amount. Now, maybe maybe Tallarico just looked at the top lines and he said, oh, I like this. This is good. This is what I want. So I'm not going to touch him. Even if that were the case, that wouldn't mean those polls are accurate or reflect even what the pollster was likely to find. The pollster, their public policy polling, I think they're sort of reputable. Impact research, I don't know anything about them. They have a client. When you have a client, you know in the back of your mind what that client wants. It's not hard to know what James Tallarico wants. He wants a poll that tells you and tells the people of Texas that he's leading, that he's going to win, that they should jump on the Tallarico bandwagon. He wants a poll that's going to demoralize Crockett supporters and keep them from getting out to the polls. It doesn't take any kind of rocket science to figure that out. So even if the polls, without any tweaking whatsoever by the Tallarico campaign, said that Tallarico was leading, that doesn't mean you can trust him. That doesn't mean you can trust the results to accurately reflect what the pollster, what an unbiased pollster would have found. So I throw those out completely. To me, again, we're not at a place where the polls are all over the place. We're at a place where the last two polls, at least on this chart, show Crockett with a growing lead. Yes, you can go back to that Emerson College poll, and it shows the opposite. But that's the only one that isn't biased on this list that shows Tallarico. And even if you go back before that Emerson College poll, yes, one poll, a reputable pollster, Emerson says Tallarico's ahead. Throughout all the other polls, except for the ones that don't have a partisan sponsor, Barbara Jordan public policy, Crockett ahead. University of Houston, Crockett ahead. There's just simply no reason to look at this chart and think that it's a toss-up, to think that the polls are all over the place. They're not. So I don't get that headline in X. Now, here's what Silver said. I think this is sort of, well, no, I don't agree with this either, actually. Now, I want to be real clear. I have no idea who's going to win this race. I don't bet. I'm not a gambling person. I don't do that. I don't trust myself. There's always VIG. In other words, if you're right half the time, you lose money. You have to be right more than half the time. You lose money because of the VIG, the house edge. I don't see myself as being able to be right more than half the time. According to Silver, not the best set of polling. I think that's fair. There aren't that many polls. It's true. Almost everything is either candidate sponsored or out of date, right? So he gets it, candidate sponsored. But then he goes on, the rule of thumb is that candidates exaggerate their standing by 3 to 5 points in internal polls. That's just a made up rule. That's just nonsense. I remember there was an internal poll back, I think it was in 22, I believe. No, it was 20, must have 20. There was a Democratic primary. No, it had to be 22. I'm sorry, I apologize. It had to be 21. It was in 21 for, no, 22. Because it was for the governor. It was for the governor of Maryland. And that's Wes Moore. And he's running for re-election in 26. So this had to be in 22, now that I think about it. And we were looking at who was likely to prevail. And the candidate that my group ultimately chose to endorse was John King. I think he was the right choice to endorse in that race, although there were some questions that came up later about his probity, which troubles me. But in the moment, John King was clearly the progressive running in that race for governor. There were the polling as the primary date approached was becoming more favorable towards Wes Moore. And it became clear that Wes Moore was very, very likely to prevail. Maybe his closest challenger was Tom Perez, who was a labor secretary under President Obama and who had been a Montgomery County council member. I live in Montgomery County, Maryland. That's where Perez is from. He was running against, there was a whole slate, but this was for the governor nomination, the nomination for Democratic candidate for governor. And Wes Moore, again, was leading. But there were polls that said maybe Perez was in striking distance, and there were a couple of other names on that list. Rashern Baker was another one. He was a former Prince George's County executive. John King was pretty far down. He was and also ran. But then a poll came out that said that they were tied, that he and Moore were tied. The pollster was commissioned by John King. I said, I don't buy it. It's not credible. I don't think there's anything to that poll. It's meaningless to me. And sure enough, King, I think, lost by about 25, 30 points. I'll look that up. That poll was just complete nonsense. It was made up out of whole cloth. So I don't give any credence to internal polls. And for Silver to say, 4 to 6 point bias is ridiculous. He just makes up that number. Now, maybe he's right in this case, but it's not something that you can take to the bank. You can look at it and say, well, okay, then probably he'll be running about 4 to 6 points behind what that poll says. You just can't do that. I'm looking here to see if I can find that Democratic primary, see what actually happened here, see the numbers. I found it's just so long. There's just so much on there from Wikipedia, which is frustrating as all get out if you want to give the top line numbers or the bottom line numbers. Or Doug Gansler, I remember, was running. Boy, what a lot of names in that primary. All right, so Wes Moore finished with 32% of the vote, 30% to Perez. So I told you it was close. Those two were close. John King finished with 3.7%. He finished 29 points behind. He had a poll out, a candidate-sponsored poll that showed him neck and neck with Wes Moore. He lost that race by 29 points. So again, take these polls that are candidate-sponsored with not just one grain of salt, but with an entire salt mine on top of them. 240-242-5646. Now, what really surprised me, I taught this yesterday, is that despite the advantages in the polling by Crockett, Tallarico's leading in the betting markets. And in fact, his lead has gone up. This morning, he was at 73%. It was around 69, 70 at airtime yesterday. This is Polymarket. Kalshi shows the exact same. I was surprised. Usually they're not exactly the same. So they have 73.29. Now that can't be right, because if you add up 73 and 29, you get to 102. But basically they're in about the same place. Crockett well behind in the betting markets. The money, the smart money, the dumb money, whatever money you want to call it, is clearly backing Tallarico. And the polling just doesn't justify that. Now, let's just keep going here, because Silver references a poll that came out. Silver says, well, there's the Tallarico poll. You got to give that a little bit of credence. And that says that he's up by 6 points. So maybe he really is tied. Again, I throw that out completely. But here is yet another poll that came out last night after my program, and after, by the way, Silver had posted his thoughts. He ultimately concludes that he thinks Tallarico is likely to win, but the odds aren't quite as favorable for Tallarico as Kalshi and Polymarket indicate. So he's maybe 65% rather than 73%. It's kind of the way I read that. The interactive polls, Chisholm Strategies, never heard of them. We'll talk about them in a moment, because you got to look at the source, folks. You got to look at the source. Chisholm Strategies says Paxton is up by 12 points over Cornyn and Wesley Hunt. I mentioned Wesley. He also ran, and in the runoff, it looks like Paxton's going to win. Now, I think that's probably right. I have no reason to doubt those numbers. According to Silver, Paxton is vulnerable. He's not a real strong candidate. There are a number of scandals. He's very hard right. He's MAGA. Strong Democrat could conceivably win. I actually believe it. I know we talked about this with Carlos on Monday. Carlos said there's no way a Democrat wins. I don't think the Democrat was likely to win, but don't forget, a Democrat won a deep red district in January in a special election by 14 points. So is Texas in play? I'd say it is. Now, this poll says Tallarico's up by 12. So let's look at Chisholm Strategies if we can. Let's find out if they're credible. I've never heard of them. When I hear the University of Texas, I think it's credible. Maybe it's not. Could be BS. But if a poll comes out of the University of Texas, or it's sponsored by the University of Texas, I think that was ultimately done. It was conducted for UT by YouGov. YouGov is a reputable pollster. I don't know who Chisholm Strategies is, but I did some research here. So according to Hurricane Hurricane Joel, guess he's credible. She's credible. Joel sounds like a man's name. The Reid Hoffman funded firm one is Blueprint Research. So Hurricane Joel is saying that the sponsor of that poll that showed Tallarico, the one that came out yesterday, that showed Tallarico up by 12, was sponsored by Reid Hoffman, who is a centrist corporate Dem, right? Is he Netflix, I think? Is that Reed Hastings? There's Reid Hoffman and there's Reed Hastings. And then Reid Hoffman is the Netflix billionaire. He's a centrist Dem. He's a corporate Dem. According to Hurricane Joel, the poll, and I couldn't find anything more about this, was done by Blueprint Polls. That is correct. It was done by Blueprint Polls, which is part of Chisholm Strategies, which is a Dem firm, a long-established Democratic firm. Well, if they're a Democratic firm, I don't trust them. I don't trust them not because I don't trust Democrats, although I don't. I don't trust them because, again, their ultimate bias, their ultimate goal is their interest. If we give them every benefit of the doubt, and I will for this conversation, ultimately, a Democratic-based firm's interest is to steer voters towards the candidate who's most likely to win the primary, according to the Democratic Party. So that doesn't mean who's most likely to win the general election. They want voters, they presumably want the Democrat to take the seat, whether regardless of whether it's Jasmine Crockett or Tallarico, they're going to err on the side of favoring in their numbers, in their published results, the candidate they think is the better general election choice. So they may really believe, or their numbers may really indicate, that Tallarico is 12 points ahead, or they may just want Texas voters to nominate James Tallarico because they believe Tallarico is the better candidate in the general election against either Ken Paxton or against John Cornyn. So again, I don't trust this poll in particular. I don't think that they are disinterested. I don't think their goal is to give you an unbiased snapshot of where the election is. I think their goal is to get Texas voters to vote for a candidate, the candidate that they think is more likely to win the election, and frankly, whose policies are more in line with the billionaire class, right? I mean, Reid Hoffman is a billionaire. So if he's going to sponsor a poll, he's going to want that poll to come up with a result that favors his particular worldview, which is he should get to have millions of dollars. Now, in this case, I don't think Crockett or Hoffman is particularly billionaire unfriendly. In fact, my understanding is that they're both relatively billionaire friendly. So I don't think it weighs in. That is a big factor, right? I don't think a factor for the pollster is, well, we like this guy's candidates and we don't like that woman's candidates. We like this guy's policies, meaning we like Tallarico, but we don't like Jasmine Crockett's policies. Because presumably they like both of their policies. By the way, LinkedIn. I said Netflix, LinkedIn. I think Reed Hastings, I'm sorry. Reed Hastings would be the Netflix founder. Now, why then would Reid Hoffman and Blueprint Polling and Chisholm Strategies think Tallarico is a stronger general election candidate than Jasmine Crockett? Well, here are the candidates, right? They show them on their page. And presumably they think that the fresh-faced young white guy, well-coiffed on the top right of this image, is more likely to beat the guy wearing this jacket and tie over the black woman in the center below. Now, are they right about that? I don't know. We heard an awful lot from Kamala Harris supporters that she lost to Trump. He won because of racism. Do I think that the average Texas voter is racist? No, I think we all have our biases. I don't think that would determine the race necessarily. It might, but it's a majority-minority state. We're going to look at the demographics in a minute. I think there is an advantage you have in Texas if you're not black, probably. So that may be part of the factor. I don't think that means she can't win. I think that may be a reason that a Democratic established firm in Texas would have a bias in favor of a white candidate over a black candidate, a white man over a black woman. I think that is plausible. So all of these are reasons to be skeptical of these polls, except for the UT and the U Houston polls. Now let's look at the actual demos. I want to look at the demographics here in Texas because I know I'm spending an awful lot of time on this stuff, but I think it's really relevant. 240-242-5646. Tallarico was talking, here's from CPND, no way. Tallarico was talking about taxing the wealthier bottom versus top. I assume they want Tallarico to lose, or they know they have enough centrists to not tax the wealthy even with Tallarico in. Yeah, I think that's the answer. And plus, people talk on the campaign trail and they say things that doesn't, people say a lot of things to get elected. But maybe he will govern as a Maybe he will truly govern as a populist. That would be cool if he wins. So here's the demos. You see nearly 40% white and 39% Latino, less than 12% black. In American as they frame it. I think you got to do pretty well among whites and Latinos if you're a Democrat to win. You don't have to get up 50% of the white vote. You need over 50%, probably, of the Latino vote, or close to it. You'll get close to 100% of the black vote. So it does make sense to me to think Tallarico, if you're a Democratic pollster, if you're a Democratic leaning pundit, commentator, to think Tallarico is an advantage. I think the real reason, really thought a lot about this, the real reason that Tallarico is favored in the poll, in the betting markets, is the reason that Taylor Remmett won last month. The progressive, the populist, who won in a ruby red district, 17-point Trump district win. He got 14%. Observers of the race, he won by 14%. Observers of the race said Remmett's working class appeal, along with Latino and suburban backlash. He won Latinos by, I think, about 40%. In other words, 70-30, maybe more than that, went to Remmett. The basic perception is the one who wins the Latino vote, especially by a big margin. Yes, Crockett could lose slightly the Latino vote and still win the primary, but there's no way either she or Tallarico can win the general without the Latino vote. The general sense is you got to win the Latino vote in Texas if you're a Democrat by a very solid margin to win the election. This is why I think the betting markets have Tallarico ahead. I'm not saying they're right, but I think they looked at that Texas poll, UT poll, that's being reported here in the Texas Tribune. The UT polls tab had Hispanic voters leaning towards Crockett by 4 points. I believe bettors don't believe that. I think bettors look at that and they say, okay, the reason Crockett is ahead in that UT poll is because the UT poll came out with the number that says Crockett's ahead with Hispanic voters. And bettors say there's just no way that's true. They reject that tab. They're saying this is wrong. Hispanic voters are not leaning towards Crockett. They're going to vote for Tallarico in big numbers. And that's why they think he's going to win. They might be wrong. I mean, they might be completely wrong about that. I don't know why the Texas poll would get it particularly. But the theory is that there's tensions between blacks and Latinos in Texas. And Jasmine Crockett did make some, I think, unfortunate remarks about picking cotton and immigrants. And I think that the bettors think that is going to keep her from winning. That's my guess. I could be wrong. I could be right. From Sans Deity, without a deity. Early voted this morning. Strangely, there were 4 voting machines on the table, all facing the line of folks waiting, only about 5 feet in front of the line. So you could see folks' votes, but we don't know who. By the way, yes, the UT poll does have her up by 12. Absolutely. If I misspoke, I'm wrong. They have, the UT poll has Crockett up by 12. They have Crockett up by 4 points among Latino voters. So that's where there's the confusion. One interesting factoid, it's anecdotal. The early voting, maybe it's not anecdotal, the early voting numbers from Houston and Dallas, which are Crockett strongholds, are solid. A lot of early voters in those 2 cities, the 2 largest in Texas. Austin, which is younger, more progressive, whiter, has less of a early vote turnout. And that's viewed as perhaps a counter indicator for Tallarico. We'll see. 240-242-5646. Always want to talk to you. I'm really fascinated by this race. I really think it'll be very, very interesting to see who wins. And yeah, I mentioned the polls that I reject. Totally different story, but I always find these interesting. The issue of birth rates. How many people are having how many babies? And the New York Times reports the birth rate is plunging. Why some say that's a good thing. The political class is worried about the historic drop, but the biggest change is among the youngest women who are the least ready to have children. So basically what the article says, and I'll go through it a little bit, but they point out that in the end, women aren't having many fewer babies today than they were 25, 30, 40 years ago. Most women are still at least hoping to have, leaning towards having approximately 2 children. But teens and early 20-somethings are having far fewer children. Women in their 30s and even early 40s are having more children. So it's kind of balancing out. The Times thing is actually kind of good news because these younger women and girls aren't having children, and they're the people who shouldn't have them. So I think that's fair. I mean, I think that's a legitimate point. And they talk about how financially it's hard to have a child, especially if you're a teen, especially if you're a 20-something. You're less likely to be married. Even if you're married, you're probably financially insecure. If you're in your 30s or 40s, even if you're not married, you're probably settled in your career. And if you're not, you may not have a kid. So they're pointing out that people who are having children today are more likely to be financially capable of raising children. And that is, I would agree, that's a good thing. But they, of course, ignore the most important factors. Most people are depressed. The environment we live in today is not a happy one. We live, and the economics are part of that, right? People feel less secure than they used to. People are less confident about their future, and with good reason. People look at the climate in terms of the political climate, and they're afraid. So when you're depressed, I've also talked about this, it's not just that young people are having fewer babies, they're actually having less sex, which I think is unfortunate. I mean, if you want, as long as it's between 2 consenting adults, that's a good thing, right? I mean, we want people to be happy, to enjoy themselves, to get something out of life. That's part of the pleasure of being alive, being a human being. It's connecting with another person on a sexual level. And yet younger people are having less sex. They're overworked. They're depressed. They're not, they don't have the mindset that they can devote to their own pleasure and that of somebody else. They're too busy just trying to survive and get ahead on a treadmill. So that's another factor. The New York Times doesn't talk about that. I think in the end, the best thing about a plunging birth rate is that the Earth, and we talk about this with, we had a great guest talking about the environment a couple times on this program, and try to get her back on. The name will come to me in a moment, but what she's talked about is we're past our carrying capacity. The Earth can maybe sustain 2-3 billion people at most. We're like at 9-10 billion people. It's just not something that we can that will work long term. We're over consuming. So that's the best thing about a plunging birth rate is if we stop the overpopulation, we need to depopulate the planet. And the people who need to depopulate the most, the fastest, are those who consume the most. And Americans consume the most. So yes, it's actually good news from that purely economic standpoint. We want to have a sustainable planet, then we have to have fewer babies. I wish the New York Times would talk about that. All right, here we go. The decline has prompted hand-wringing among portions of the political class with some conservatives. Of course, they are calling it the triumph of selfishness over sacrifice. But I don't think there's anything that can be called more selfish than having children. It's putting what you want, if you have children over everything else. The time of scarcity, the time of great numbers of impoverished people, at a time of desertification, ecocide, the last thing we should be doing is putting our own desire to procreate, our own desire to replicate ourselves, which is obviously genetic. I mean, if you didn't do that, if you didn't want to procreate and replicate yourself, you wouldn't. And the genes that impel you not to do that wouldn't get passed down. The genes that impel you to have sex and children are the ones that will be passed down. There's a huge evolutionary advantage to having children and wanting to have children. And of course, it's a complete dead end if you don't. But just because you have a genetic advantage because you want to have kids doesn't mean it's good for you. It doesn't mean it's what's best for you. It just means that it's a survival strategy that works. Survival strategy for you, for your genes, not even necessarily for the species. So there's nothing more selfish than putting your own genetic legacy first, last, and always. I always find it ironic that people think that it's selfish not to have kids. 240-242-5646 if you want to join me. But again, the main point is today, women still want to have kids. I always find that odd. I really do. I mean, it's like, really? I guess it's, again, for the reason I just gave, which is because if you didn't want to have kids, you wouldn't have kids. And therefore, the gene that provides you with the preference not to have kids wouldn't get passed down. It seems kind of obvious that would be the reason. But, we aren't just captive to our preferences. We can actually do things because we want to, because we put our mind over our matter. And we make a decision that even though we may want to do this today, in the long run, it's not what's best for us. It's not what will make us happiest. So I do find this interesting. But again, for those who are, wringing their hands that there won't be enough salaries to sustain Social Security in 40 or 50 years, which, by the way, is an incredibly selfish reason. The people at Heritage Foundation and other conservatives say, well, we need lots of children so that they'll be working when we retire and we'll be able to retire. But that's very selfish, right? You're saying other people should have kids so that you can retire. That sounds pretty selfish to me. It doesn't sound selfless at all. The overwhelming majority of American women still want children, and they mostly want two. Well, that's fine because two is below replacement level. In other words, if every woman, who was able to had two kids, we'd have a declining population, which is, again, what we need. But just one final point. This was interesting. This is in the Daily Telegraph. Think having children will make you happier. Think again. And this just confirms many studies that show that women with children, especially, are not happier than women without men. Sometimes they say dads may be happier because fathers tend to be less bogged down, if you want to use that term, in the day-to-day mundane aspects of child raising, which can often be very depressing. So women are taking the lion's share of the work, and they are not happier as a result, especially poor and working class women. Once you're middle class and above, the stresses of child raising are not as big a problem. But even affluent women aren't necessarily happier. They just aren't spending a lot of time raising kids, even the ones they have. So yeah, I mean, I think it's, in the end, we'd have to say it's good news. By the way, it's Kirsten State. Kirsten State, our great environmental guest, and we'll try to get Kirsten back on. She's been working really hard, been hard to get her on. I wanted to play a little bit of Kulinski, Kyle Kulinski, the secular talk guy who has a huge following. And I really don't, he doesn't do it for me. I've been critical of him, and I've been playing Sam Cedar lately because I've really appreciated Cedar. I think he's come around. He's become more populist. He's become more of a progressive. He was against force the vote. I think today he might even support force the vote. Kulinski's not a fan, but I want to play, something that he broadcast a couple days ago. This is about the report from Axios that the Dem Post-Mortem commissioned by the Democratic National Commission shows that Gaza may not have cost Paris the election, but certainly didn't help. That it was, in their words, a net negative. That Harris's pro-Israel at all costs, unconditional support hurt the Democrats. Here's Kulinski weighing in.
So, but look, make no mistake about it. Yes, I think they're hiding the results of the report because the results sort of validate every single left-wing trope. The left-wing tropes being, yeah, you needed to break up with Israel. You needed to cut off the weapons. You needed to call them out. You needed to say, let's sanction them and shit like that. And by the way, they would never actually go that far. They should, but they would never go that far. But even if they just said, we're going to cut off the weapons, that alone would have been earth-shattering, right? But I think it validates that. I think it validates that she shouldn't have campaigned with Liz Cheney. And also, look, based off what we all saw with our own two eyes, early on, when Kamala became the choice, she was actually soaring. There was one poll, she was up like 6 points over Trump. And at that moment, they were really embracing more of a left-wing insurgent energy, where she was talking about banning price gouging for groceries and universal child care. And she picked Tim Walz, who was out there.
So I think that's actually somewhat true. I think there's something to that point. I made that point as well, that when Kamala first was announced or anointed to be the candidate, she was doing pretty well in the polls. And she was running somewhat of a more populist campaign. She never said she would break with Israel. She never said that she was going to be a different president than Joe Biden or break with his policies. But she was a bit of a blank slate at that point. People weren't sure where she was going to go, and people wanted to believe she would be progressive. And she threw a few hints, nothing concrete, nothing definite, but a few little hints in that direction. And that probably did help her. But Kulinski is right. Yeah, she was basically a corporatist, a militarist, and that's why she lost. And what's frustrating about this is he was a supporter. He was backing her. He was all there for her. At least if he could say, yeah, well, look, I mean, she was bad. She was a bad king. Won't do that. He's not going to say that. And he's not going to say, yeah, well, this is why. And what this really shows you is this is why we need to support Green Party candidates. We need to support anyone but Democrats at this, unless they're, and even if they're a Mamdani, they're not perfect. Mamdani's endorsed Kathy Hochul. Mamdani said, don't primary Hakeem Jeffries. Yeah, I would vote. I would have voted. I worked for, I volunteered for Mamdani. But man, if there's a true progressive alternative, I think that's the way we got to go. That's the only way we're going to make things different. Chris Hedges says we got to get in the streets. We got to take the system down, basically, take it offline, cost the billionaire class money. And I don't disagree. That would be effective, maybe. But how are you going to get people to do that? People who are just barely surviving, desperate to make ends meet. You're saying you got to give up even more. You got to go on strike. You got to take no money at all. You got to risk police truncheons, ICE thugs. You got to have the president maybe do what Biden did, which is just simply say you got to get back to work, which is what he told the railway workers. We could have a revolution simply by embracing Green Party candidates like Butch. Can you imagine Butch Ware won the Democratic or won the primary in California? It'd be amazing. It would be just an earthquake. It'd be earth-shattering. Why isn't Kulinski telling you to vote for him? That's what I find so incredibly frustrating. CPND, I love Kyle, but then he says, I agree, they don't have to be 100%, but the more left, the better. And I hated that Biden. Yeah, well, this is the thing, CPND, I'm talking to you here. So you love Kulinski, but Kulinski was all in for Joe Biden even after he broke the railway workers. Here's more from Kulinski. Kulinski today recognizing just how bad the Republicans are. Well, we all recognize that. How about the Democrats?
Guys, this is going to drive you absolutely crazy, and I know because it drove me absolutely crazy, and it is just so disturbing and so unsettling and devastating. Devastating is the best word to use for it. So take a look at this. New top Democrats are working behind the scenes to stop a vote.
I'm going to stop it there for a sec because I just want to make a few points. So this is Dateline Feb 24. Today is actually the 27th. So this is 3 days ago. And there's a tweet there from Aida Chavez. I'm not sure who she is, but the story was reported in Common Dreams exactly the way Kulinski is describing it. Reported in Common Dreams the following day, the 25th, exactly as Kulinski is describing it. The top Dems are working behind the scenes. And of course, the picture of them are, the Schumer and Jeffries to stop a vote on the Massey Iran War Powers Resolution. Now, Kulinski is rightly livid at that point. He's furious. And he should be. Let me play a little more of that.
Massey Iran War Powers Resolution, a vote that would force every member of Congress to go on the record over Trump's potential regime change war. This, ladies and gentlemen, is completely and utterly unacceptable. Hakeem Jeffries has to resign. Chuck Schumer has to resign. Democratic leadership is a disgrace. They're a disgrace.
So 100%, they're awful. But Kulinski consistently supports Democrats. He defends Democrats. And every last one of them voted for those two men to be their leaders. If you rightly recognize just how awful Schumer and Jeffries are, then why do you support Democrats and the party more generally, given that Jeffries and Schumer are the unanimous choice of leaders who buck the American public at every opportunity. In fact, buck the majority of Democrats, a large majority of Democrats. It's an incredibly bad strategy to support a war with Iran, to give a blank check to Trump. In fact, as Yuga points out, few Americans support U.S. military action against Iran. The one great way to score points in a midterm election year is to rally support for limits, for guardrails on Trump. And if you think Trump is such a fascist, why wouldn't you do that? If you're so afraid that Trump is going to plunge us into war, which you should be, why wouldn't you enact the guardrails? And Kulinski is saying, well, they don't want to do that. And they need him for that reason. They need to be impeached. They're not going to be impeached. They're the unanimous choice of Democratic members of Congress. 49% of Americans oppose military force. 76% of Democrats oppose it. 3/4. And by the way, that doesn't mean 24% support an attack on Iran. That means 76% oppose it. And most independents, this is smart strategy, smart politics to make the Republicans go on record in support of war with Iran. It's very smart politics. Jeffries and Schumer, according to Kulinski, according to Aida Chavez's tweet, according to Common Dreams, Schumer and Jeffries are kiboshing a vote on that issue, which would be very, very politically, which is very politically stupid on their part to do that. And Kulinski gets that. He gets it's a mistake. And yet, he still all in for the Dems. Now, let me just update, because the leadership, at least in the House, has backtracked. So House Democratic leadership on Thursday announced, so that's yesterday, right? The tweet was Tuesday. Kulinski's video that I played was Wednesday. Yesterday, the House Dem leadership, Jeffries, said, no, we're going to go along with this. We want that vote. And it could well pass, which would be a really good thing. Let's hope it does. The reason I play Kulinski is because I don't get the guy. He goes after the Democratic National Committee for suppressing the Post-Mortem, which shows that the Democratic Party is pro-war and that hurt them, pro-genocide and hurt them. His policies, he's against war. He's against genocide. He's harshly critical of the Democratic leadership when it appeared that they were refusing a vote on the wisdom of war with Iran. And yet he consistently supports voting for Democrats. And he doesn't just support voting. He's like, this is an old clip. As far as I know, he's never renounced this clip.
Authority to do that. That'd be the best thing to do. He didn't do that, but can we at least acknowledge the facts of what went down? And I see this rugged insistence. Honestly, it's like Biden derangement syndrome among some people on the left.
It's Biden derangement syndrome, according to Kulinski, if you criticize Biden. What he was saying, he didn't do it. When he said, well, he didn't do it. What he didn't do was he didn't support the railway workers in their strike. And Brown Joy Gray said, that's really bad. That's not pro-labor. That's not a good thing. He's not doing a good thing there. And said, well, he wasn't already, we'll acknowledge that. But he's so much better, is according to Kulinski.
Crap derangement syndrome among some people on the left. The fact that we can't all agree very quickly that, well, obviously Democrats are not 10 times better than Republicans. They're 100 times better than Republicans. And even if you are somebody who's a purist and you're on the left, you can acknowledge a W in the instances you get it while still pushing.
Right. Purist. You're a purist if you criticize the Democrats, if you criticize Biden. And Democrats are 100 times better. He was saying that at a time when the Democrats had promoted war with Iran, war with Russia, and to his credit, before the genocide by Israel had begun in full force. But when the Democrats were completely behind Israel, nevertheless. So, I mean, it's fine. You want to criticize the DNC for not revealing the post-mortem? You want to go after Jeffries and Schumer because at least they indicated they didn't want to vote on war with Iran? Fine. That's good. You should do that. But then you need to take the next step, which is say it's time for a change. We've got to break with this party. And he won't do that. But it's clear. It's clear from what he said that that's exactly what we need. We need a break from the Democratic Party. All right. It is actually not even a full hour's program, but I am going to, is there a third? No, I got to the story about, I did that. The third story was the second story was a story about the dropping birth rate. If I got a call, I was hoping for a call, but no calls. So have a great weekend. Thank you all who tuned in. Greatly appreciated. Don't forget, last opportunity while I'm live. You can still subscribe now if you haven't already done so. Love the comments. Have a great weekend. Thanks so much for being part of Halitics. I'll be